highest priority. Our intelligence reported that at Clark and Iber fields rested the bulk of American air power in the Philippines. It was necessary to destroy this if our operations were to proceed with any degree of safety. This distance between our Formosa bases and the Philippine Islands created a tremendous obstacle. Our planes in China often flew long missions, especially between Hankou and Chongqing, but the proposed Formosa to Philippines and return raids exceeded even the most strenuous flights of the Sino-Japanese incident. Further complications arose from the fact that the greater portion of the Formosa Philippines flight would have to be made over water, which increased the possibilities of navigational error. Even were these obstacles to be overcome, we still faced the hazards of excessive bomber losses, since the distances involved appeared far beyond the maximum capabilities of our fighter planes. The Chinese, with inferior fighters, had effectively defended their cities against our unescorted bomber formations, and we realized only too well that the superior caliber of American pilots and planes promised severe bomber losses. It was possible that in the Zero we possessed the world's first fighter airplane capable of flying the 900 nautical miles for the round trip between Formosa and Luzon. Actually, we would have to provide for the equivalent of at least 1,300 nautical miles of flight, since the Zeros would inevitably be called on to engage in fuel-consuming dogfights. We also had to consider additional factors. The effective flight range of an airplane is determined by more than merely still air flight. The size of the formations would in great part determine the eventual fuel consumption of our planes, and much would depend upon our pilots' flying skill. Experience had taught us that a pilot well versed in the art of flying, by the seat of his pants, could extend by a considerable margin the maximum range of his airplane, as compared to the individual who flew mechanically. In China, we always realized maximum efficiency from our formations, and were assured that our men possessed the highest flying skill. Circumstances then permitted us to select for Zero fighter operations only our crack pilots, and our formation flights never exceeded in size the 30 Zero mission against Chengdu. Once we placed the Zero in mass production and assigned large numbers to operational fleet units, we forfeited the luxury of critical pilot selection. Our commitment to a decisive war with America and England demanded the use of every available Zero fighter against the enemy, although we might lack what we considered a desirable number of crack pilots. Consequently, in the summer of 1941, we assigned to our aircraft carriers half of those pilots who had fought in China under Lieutenant Saburo Shindo's command. The remaining veterans, under Lieutenant Tamotsu Yokoyama's leadership, were transferred to the land-based air forces. Thus, the difficulties of the Formosa Philippines operation mounted steadily. To raid Luzon with Zero fighter planes, we were required to use the relatively few seasoned pilots as a nucleus, around which we built a force of nearly 250 Zero fighters, including spare planes which we assigned to the Tainan and the 3rd Air Corps. The magnitude of the forthcoming Luzon assault demanded that we employ larger fighter plane formations than we had ever sent into combat. The difficulties of maintaining formation with large groups of airplanes complicate the pilot's efforts to maintain minimum fuel consumption. The mass formations inevitably resulted in a reduction in the Zero's operating radius of action. Perhaps our greatest worry lay in the fact that the American and Philippine forces would expect our attack and consequently would be able fiercely to resist our planes with a maximum number of interceptors. Since we were to open the war with the Hawaiian operation, the Philippines would have ample time in which to bolster their defences. The unfavourable timing demanded that we attack Luzon with every available airplane. Everything depended upon the ability of the Zero fighters to wrest control of the local air from the defenders. Cognizant of our difficulties, the General Staff in Tokyo and the Combined Fleet General Staff ordered every possible action taken to increase the flight endurance of the Zero fighters in Formosa. Again, we were faced with a problem other than that of range. We had to calculate the effect upon our pilots of the long hours spent in the air within the small Zero cockpits, Our pilots must engage American fighters after spending what we considered was a prohibitive number of flying hours before entering combat. In early October of 1940, 3 small aircraft carriers, the Ryujo, Zuiho, and Kasuga Maru, arrived in southern Formosa. We commenced special deck takeoff and landing training, for our plan was to move the carriers as close as possible to Luzon before launching our attack in the Philippines. By so doing, we would reduce effectively the time spent in the air by our fighter pilots. Further, our planes would not have to take off in early morning darkness to coordinate their attack with that of the Nagumo force. There is a difference of 5 hours and 20 minutes in the time of sunrise between Pearl Harbor and Luzon. The carrier operation would allow our planes to attack Luzon, engage in air combat, and return directly to Formosa. Subsequent events forced us to review critically our proposed carrier attack. Our larger carriers were all committed to specific operations for the morning of December 8, 1941, and the 3 carriers assigned to the Philippines campaign were maddeningly slow, had small carrier decks, and could accommodate no more than 75 planes in all. For long months, our pilots would be limited to practicing carrier operations, and would never receive the special simulated combat training which they required. The performance of each plane would suffer from the added weight of aircraft carrier operation equipment. In early 1941, there were in Formosa many of Japan's outstanding fighter plane strategists and pilots, including Commander Motoharu Okamura, Commander Yasuna Kozono, Commander Takeo Shibata, Lieutenant Hideki Shingo, and the China veteran, Lieutenant Tamotsu Yokoyama. For months, the renowned flyer Captain Masahisa Saito of the Tainan Air Corps and Captain Yoshio Kame of the 3rd Air Corps drove their pilots near to exhaustion, steadily improving the range of their Zero fighters, increasing the efficiency of formation flights, and extending the flight endurance time of the fighters. Captain Saito and Captain Kame were hard taskmasters. Day after day, they sent their pilots into the air under conditions which exceeded our worst experiences in China. The severe training discipline reaped a golden harvest. Saito's pilots steadily increased the endurance time of their Zeros, ranging further and further in non-stop flights from their home bases. 10-hour flights became routine, then this figure jumped to 11, and finally our fighter pilots flew simulated combat missions of 12 continuous hours in the air. In flights up to and exceeding 10 hours, our pilots reduced their fuel consumption to 21 gallons per hour. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai achieved the amazing fuel consumption of only 18 gallons per hour. The reduction in fuel consumption, with its accompanying greater range and flight endurance, brightened the prospects of the Luzon attack. With a guaranteed minimum of 10 hours of flight time, the Zeros would be able to fly from Formosa to Luzon, combat the American fighters, and return to their home bases with fuel to spare. Our biggest problem was solved. Vice Admiral Nishizo Tsukahara, Commander-in-Chief of the 11th Air Fleet and the commander of land-based air forces in the Formosa Theatre, informed Navy General Headquarters that the 3 aircraft carriers were no longer required for the Philippines attack. Here was concrete proof that our ceaseless efforts to achieve in the Zero hitherto impossible performance had paid handsome dividends. The fighters' unparalleled range enabled the Navy to relieve the 3 carriers of their intended mission. The Ryujo steamed to Palau Island to join in the campaign against Davao, Mindanao Island, and the Zuiho and Kasuga Maru returned to Japan for other assignments. On the very eve of the impending war, we thus gained the equivalent of 3 vitally important aircraft carriers for our initial thrusts against the enemy. The intended Naval Air Force distribution for the opening of the Philippines campaign on December 8, 1941, was: we assembled at these bases a total of 184 Zero fighters, 192 land-based attack bombers, 120 Type 1 and 72 Type 96, and 24 Type 97 flying boats. Only 108 Zeros and 144 attack bombers were capable of joining the difficult long-range operations. Later, this number diminished even further when we transferred to southern French Indochina approximately half the strength of the Kanoya Air Corps, leaving us with 117 operational attack bombers. Our intelligence selected as priority targets the well-equipped Clark and Eber fields on Luzon Island. We dismissed as unimportant the secondary Nichols field in the Manila suburbs. Early in the morning of December 8, 1941, thick fog rolled in from the sea completely to shroud our air bases. On the very first day of the war, when a coordinated effort was of the utmost importance, our planes could not leave their fields. We cursed and fumed, for even as we paced helplessly in the swirling gloom, the Nagumo Task Force planes turned Pearl Harbor into a shambles. If the enemy in the Philippines had the opportunity to counterattack quickly, he could disrupt completely our carefully laid plans. Finally, the initial reports of the Pearl Harbor raid reached us through Tokyo. Still, the fog did not lift. After long hours of chaining us to the ground, the fog dispersed before the morning sun. We wasted no time, and, as quickly as their engines could be warmed, the fighters and bombers thundered from the field and headed southward. As the gods of war would have it, the crippling fog proved to be a tremendous asset in our attack against the American air bases. Our planes reached Luzon Island at 1:30 p.m., Tokyo time, several hours later than we had originally scheduled. By this quirk of circumstances, we caught the American fighters completely off guard. Receiving the reports of the Pearl Harbor attack, the fighters took to the air in anticipation of a forthcoming raid. After waiting in vain for several hours for our planes, which were then sitting helplessly on the ground, the enemy planes, their fuel exhausted, returned to their fields. Almost immediately afterward, our fighters and bombers swept in to attack. Admiral Tsukahara's battle report of the day's events follows. On the morning of December 8th, 54 Type 1 land-based attack bombers, the majority of the 1st Air Corps, bombed and destroyed 40 to 50 of the 60 enemy planes on Clark Field. 34 Zero fighters of the Tainan Air Corps, led by Lieutenant Shingo, flew escort. Immediately following completion of the bombing runs, the Zeros descended to treetop level and in sweeping attacks strafed and destroyed almost all the remaining enemy planes. 54 Type 96 land-based attack bombers of the Takao Air Corps, escorted by 50 Zero fighters of the 3rd Air Corps under command of Lieutenant Yokoyama, bombed and destroyed all of approximately 25 planes at Eber Field. 2 of our Zero fighter units encountered an estimated 15 enemy planes in the air and in the ensuing battle shot down the entire enemy fighter force. The effectiveness of our attacks has exceeded our fondest expectations. The sweeping raids reduced in a single stroke the major American offensive power in the Philippines. Our intelligence estimated an enemy strength of some 300 airplanes throughout the Philippine Islands on the first day of the war. Our initial attack destroyed at least 1/3 of this number. The sudden destruction of so large a segment of the air power of the United States, an enemy whom we expected to offer bitter resistance, infected our air crews with the desire to destroy the remaining enemy air force completely. After the war, we learned that the United States Army Air Forces had on Luzon Island on December 8, 1941, 160 planes, including 35 B-17 heavy bombers. Our initial attack destroyed or rendered useless at least 60 of these. On the war's second day, severe storms reduced the effectiveness of our attacking planes. High winds and rain forced several fighters into the sea. On December 10th, however, a savage aerial attack effectively neutralized the Cavite Naval Base area in South Manila. 48 hours later, not a single enemy plane remained on Luzon Island to contest our rampaging Zero fighters. Within these 3 days, the aerial operations against Luzon Island ceased. By the 4th day, December 13th, we dismissed the possibility of any form of enemy aerial counterattack. In 3 days, our Zero fighters had given us absolute aerial supremacy in this theatre of war. At first glance, these successes closely resemble the operations of the German Air Force in its overwhelming victories against Poland and France in the early days of World War II. A closer appraisal of the 2 air campaigns, notably of the numbers of aircraft employed both by our naval air forces and those of the Luftwaffe, reveals the slim numerical margin with which our forces operated. Ours was a battle resting entirely upon qualitative superiority and tactics, while the Luftwaffe, as can be seen in the accompanying charts, enjoyed both qualitative and overwhelming quantitative advantages. After the beginning of the war, we learned that, although the Zero fighter had appeared in battle in China more than a year prior to December of 1941, the Allies professed astonishment at the sight of our new fighter and were caught completely unaware by the Zero's performance. Months after the Philippines campaign, the Allies still did not realize the true flight capabilities of the Zero. When Zeros raided Port Darwin, Australia, early in 1942, the enemy accepted without question the fact that the Zeros must have flown from our carriers, when in reality they flew from our newly captured land bases on Timor Island. In every operation in December of 1941, we quickly attained numerical as well as qualitative superiority. We fully appreciated the fact that the geographical isolation of the Pacific and Asiatic battle areas would prevent the enemy from rapidly reinforcing his air forces, and that by quick, decisive onslaughts we would not only achieve local air supremacy, but would retain this advantage. Within 10 days of the opening bombing attack, the enemy planes disappeared entirely from the Philippines. Our forces wasted no time in pressing their newly won gains. On December 25th, our task force swarmed ashore on Jolo Island in the southern part of the Sulu Sea and occupied its airfield. To obtain local air coverage, we dispatched 24 Zero fighters of the Tainan Air Corps in a mass non-stop formation flight of 1,200 nautical miles. The flight of the single-seat fighter planes was unprecedented in aviation history. Our fighters experienced little difficulty in ridding the skies of the remaining enemy planes. By early March of 1942, our naval land-based air forces had landed in the string of South Pacific islands. Quickly, the entire Dutch East Indies came under the control of our air force. The Tainan Air Corps advanced to Bali Island in the Dutch East Indies, through Jolo Island, Tarakan, Balikpapan, and Banjarmasin. The 3rd Air Corps flew to Davao, Manado, and Kendari, Celebes, then divided into 2 groups, the first of which advanced through Makassar to Bali Island. The second group moved into Dili on Timor Island by way of Amboina. Under Admiral Tsukahara's command, the naval land-based air forces in the southern Pacific area definitely shot down in air combat and destroyed on the ground a total of 565 enemy planes from December 8, 1941, until the close of the Java operation. Of this number, our Zero fighters accounted for 471 planes, or 83% of the total. We can judge the effectiveness of our Zero fighters by observing that in all our operations in the first months of the war, the Zero fighters of our land and carrier-based air forces destroyed 65% of all the enemy planes lost. This accomplishment contributed directly to the success of our operations, in many respects, other than the destruction of the enemy aircraft. Without control of the air, our bombers and torpedo planes could not possibly have eliminated enemy resistance so thoroughly. We have stressed, perhaps repetitiously, the role of this one airplane in the initial phases of the Pacific War. We feel, however, that at Pearl Harbor, as well as in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies, we could not possibly have achieved our sea, land, and air victories with a fighter plane of lesser performance than the Zero. Our entire strategy depended upon the success of this aircraft. On December 10, 1941, the 3rd day of the Pacific War, Japan received news of a tremendous victory which greatly affected our future military operations in Pacific and Asiatic waters. 2 of England's most powerful warships, the dreadnought Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse of the British Asiatic Fleet, had been sent to the bottom off the Malayan coast. The victory was accomplished without the participation of Japanese surface vessels. 75 twin-engine, land-based attack bombers of the Navy's 22nd Air Flotilla, under the command of Rear Admiral Sadaichi Matsunaga, had carried out the devastating attack, and in a single blow, rendered Britain's Asiatic sea power impotent. Even more dramatically than the Pearl Harbor attack, this action typified the sudden changes in a balance of military power which could be wrought by bombing aircraft. Japan's air power accomplished England's reduction from her position as a major naval power in the Indian Ocean to a state of helplessness at the unbelievably low cost of only 3 bombing airplanes, all of which succeeded in crashing into a British warship as they went down. During the summer of 1941, the 22nd Air Flotilla had been undergoing intensified combat flight training at the Naval Air Force Base in southern Formosa. In late October, the flotilla was ordered to move its headquarters to Saigon, the capital of French Indochina. 2 air corps of the flotilla were simultaneously transferred to new bases. The Genzan Air Corps, consisting of 48 Type 96 land-based attack bombers, moved to Saigon via Hainan Island, and the Mihiro Air Corps, similarly equipped with 48 Type 96 bombers, transferred to Thu Dau Mot, north of Saigon. The flotilla's fighter plane unit, consisting of 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters, and the reconnaissance plane unit with 6 Type 98 land-based reconnaissance planes, were moved under direct command of Rear Admiral Matsunaga to the advanced base at Sok Trang, south of Saigon. These air units were specifically charged with destruction of enemy fleet forces and the protection of our troop transports, carrying the Army Malaya Landing Force destruction of the enemy's air forces stationed around Singapore, maintaining a sea patrol. The strategy adopted just prior to the opening of hostilities in the Pacific War called for the Army Air Force to assume air responsibility for this area. At this time, however, the Army Air Force lacked striking power and was almost useless for air combat operations. The Navy had little faith in the ability of Army units to attack with any success the enemy's surface vessels. Indeed, the Army was sadly deficient in the means and the experience with which to carry out overwater military activities. Had the war broken out at this time, October, rather than during the planned date of the first week in December, the Army would not have possessed a single aircraft capable of bombing Singapore, the largest and most powerful British base in the area, from our main base in French Indochina. This deplorable situation prevailed despite the fact that the British fleet and the bombers based at Singapore were considered the greatest menace to the Army transports which had been scheduled to carry the Army landing force from French Indochina for the invasion of Malaya. Considering the vital objectives at hand, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, personally interceded and ordered the 22nd Air Flotilla to move immediately to its new bases in French Indochina. In late November of 1941, we received intelligence reports stating that 2 British battleships had been sighted moving in an easterly direction through the Indian Ocean. Additional reports from the area indicated later that the 2 warships had arrived at Singapore on December 2nd or 3. It was also determined that the commander of the newly strengthened fleet was Vice Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, and that the 2 large warships were the new King George Theave and the fast battlecruiser Repulse. Subsequent to the action of December 10th, the battleship was identified as the Prince of Wales, of the same class as the King George V, which 6 months previously had played an important role in the sinking of the German dreadnought Bismarck. The Japanese plans for the Malayan invasion were seriously threatened by the unexpected appearance of the 2 powerful British warships in the area. Conservative estimates by our intelligence indicated that the 2 British warships were even more powerful than our fast battleships Kongo and Haruna. Then, under the command of Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, the leading Japanese Navy commander in the theatre and Commander-in-Chief of the Second Fleet. Admiral Kondo had under his direct command not only the 2 battleships, but also 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser and 10 destroyers. In addition to this force, 5 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser and 14 destroyers were under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, Commander-in-Chief of the Malaya Force. To support this surface strength, Admiral Yamamoto, when informed of the appearance of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse at Singapore, ordered 27 Type 1 land-based attack bombers of the Kanoya Air Corps, which had been stationed in South Formosa, to move immediately to a new base in French Indochina. They were placed under the command of Rear Admiral Matsunaga. This was the final disposition of our forces in the area, as the scheduled date for initiating the war approached. By the middle of the first week in December, our air, sea and ground forces were poised to strike against the enemy. Our operations involved the taut period of waiting and patrolling. We paid particularly close attention to the movements of the British Asiatic Fleet. Starting early in December, partly for the purpose of tracking the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, we patrolled the ocean waters surrounding French Indochina, Malaya and Borneo daily with land-based attack bombers. Tension among the air units was at a high pitch. To date, all our movements had been carried out successfully, but at any moment the enemy might discover our plans and cause confusion among the closely coordinated activities of our air, sea and land elements. Lieutenant Sado Takai, a squadron leader of the Gensan Air Corps, who participated in the pre-attack sea patrol and later in the Malaya sea battle, kept detailed notes of activities at the time. 2 days before the scheduled date of opening hostilities, we patrolled the ocean as far as 100 nautical miles south of Singapore. Patrol duty was an unpleasant experience. We were a single lonely plane flying through the cloudless skies over the southern sea. My crew uttered hardly a word during these long flights, almost constantly holding their breath, their eyes turned towards Singapore. The great British military base had been set as our target on the first night of the war, in the event that the British fleet should fail to leave the protection of the shore guns. Perhaps my men were carrying out their duties too intently. They seemed to be attempting to gain useful experience from every moment spent in the air during the tedious patrol missions. Everyone in the aircraft was in a confused state of mind, which was caused by the need for constant caution, by anticipation as to what would occur when the fighting began, and by a strong desire to be as proficient as possible in his duties. Not a single vessel or airplane was seen. The sea, stretching endlessly before our bomber, was so calm that not a wave was visible. It was hardly believable that only 2 days from now the war would start. Full-scale patrol of the ocean area in which the first attacks would take place had commenced several days before the scheduled opening of hostilities. But, as is evident from Lieutenant Takai's detailed report, many of the searching bombers failed to sight any movement on the part of the British fleet or air forces. Some British planes were observed by the Japanese bombers, but without hostile action taken by either side. Lieutenant Takai's report continues. The Navy had ordered that all personnel engaged in search missions were to concentrate on the movement of the 2 British battleships. We flew our patrols every day, seeing nothing, growing more and more tense as the attack date approached. The nerve-wracking stillness over the ocean might well be described as the calm before the storm. December 6, 1941. The troop transports carrying the Army landing force scheduled to invade the east shores of Malaya were proceeding westward off the South Indochina coast. Troop convoys are always infuriatingly slow in their movement. This phase of the attack operation was the bottleneck in our scheduled invasion of the enemy-held territory. Under constant fighter plane cover, however, the fleet was advancing slowly toward Kota Baru in Malaya. Fortunately, the sea was calm, and the transports went unobserved, but this Japanese feudal lord procession-like fleet could not remain completely safe forever. On this same day, our worst fears were realized. British flying boat patrol bombers discovered the convoy of troopships. Our entire invasion plan was completely exposed to the enemy long before we were able to launch the invasion of Malaya. It was perfectly clear to the British what a fleet composed of 30 vessels in formation represented, to what area it was headed, and when it would arrive at its destination. We were compelled to immediately change our tactics from secret operation to open movement. The possibility of an enemy aerial attack on our air bases in French Indochina was a cause for grave concern. Immediately we began to disperse our bombing squadrons to bases covering a wider area than they embraced. The day before the opening of the war dawned quietly. We hoped and prayed that the enemy would not take any action. Every radio dispatch was carefully studied for a hint of possible attack. We were worried that the British might attack the troopship convoy. Whenever a long interval went by without receipt of a radio dispatch, we feared we might have missed the news of possible fighting. On the other hand, whenever a radio message was received, we were afraid it would bring bad news. The scope of the area and the size of the forces involved were so great that almost anything could happen. We all wondered if our meticulously laid plans would really succeed. The constant waiting and wondering made sleep almost impossible. My most important duty was to have all my bombers prepared to launch an attack at a moment's notice. The armament we were to carry would, of course, depend upon the object of any attack. If land objectives were to be bombed, then special bomb racks would have to be mounted, because we would carry a large number of small-size bombs. If enemy ships were to be attacked, we would carry either heavy bombs or torpedoes. Unless my airplanes were in constant readiness to be loaded with any of these three types of weapons, they would be useless for the forthcoming air battles, in which even the slightest delay in joining the action could prove disastrous. The ground crews which maintained our planes in combat-ready condition were little known to the public, in contrast to the attention bestowed upon the flight crews. It often happens, however, that the armament and ground crews hold the key to victory or defeat. No sign was received to indicate that the British fleet would leave Singapore to attack our surface vessels. The order was given. We would bomb Singapore on the first night of the war as originally scheduled. The flight crew of every airplane had been trained to perfection. This was our final moment. We had studied the bombing and attack plans so many times we had memorized every detail. Special preparations were unnecessary. Beyond the normal need for mechanical maintenance and the loading of our aircraft with bombs or torpedoes, we were ready to attack. Our only worry was the strength of possible enemy aerial counterattacks. However, as the war was to be opened in this theatre by bombs dropped by our own aircraft, everyone was in high spirits. We were determined to frighten the enemy out of their wits. This was to be our first large-scale naval action, and our concern was not for our safety, but rather how much damage our aerial bombs and torpedoes would inflict on the enemy battleships. December 7th, 1941. The day just before the opening of the war passed quietly and without incident. The British failed to attack. 3 squadrons, 27 planes of the Mihiro Air Corps, and 3 squadrons of the Genzan Air Corps roared from their bases in South Indochina into the black of night for Singapore, as scheduled. The southern sky was filled with cumulonimbus clouds, which were peculiar to this area. My fears of very bad weather were realized when the 27 bombers of the Genzan Air Corps, to which I belonged, suddenly were enveloped in thick clouds as we were climbing. As squadron leader of the 2nd Squadron, I placed my plane at the head of a 9-bomber flight. Visibility was so poor that it was almost impossible to recognize the formation lights of the 2 aircraft immediately behind me. The air was extremely rough. The plane rocked and shook. Sheets of rain drummed on the wings and fuselage and smashed against the cockpit windshield. Without changing course, I began a descent to a lower altitude. Behind me, some high, others low, could be seen the glowing red, green and yellow lights of the bombers in my squadron as they struggled to maintain formation in the rough air. Every now and then great flashes of lightning were reflected from the whirling propeller blades of the bombers. The pilots were trying desperately to hold the group together, so that they would not be left behind or separated from the formation, to become lost over the sea. I was still losing altitude when directly below the aircraft there appeared the dull white crests of waves streaking the black ocean surface. I pulled up from the steady descent and searched for the other bombers. Only 2 of the original squadron of 9 were in sight. It seemed almost impossible to reorganize the formation. I was still looking vainly for an area of clear sky amidst the boiling clouds and rain, when a return to base order was received by wireless from Lieutenant Commander Nichi Nakanishi, our wing commander. All bombers returned to their takeoff points. Later that night, we received a radio message telling of the successful first bombing attack on Singapore. The Mihiro Air Corps bombers were unobstructed by weather and had carried out their raids as scheduled. Our bomber crews were annoyed and disgusted that, in the first attack of the war, the Genzan Air Corps had not even reached its bombing objective and, because of weather conditions, had been scattered all over the sky. December 8, 1941. This morning it dawned quietly. By some miracle, the enemy had still not attacked our air bases in French Indochina, much to the relief of all pilots and crew members. Our army planes were already active and were carrying out their bombing missions against the enemy forces. It was inconceivable that the enemy would not launch a heavy attack against our airfields, and my squadron moved at once to a nearby French Army airbase. A French Army officer approached my bomber this morning, smiling broadly and speaking rapidly in his native tongue. It had been a long time since I studied French at the Naval Academy, and I was unable to understand a word he was saying. We later discovered that the French officer had been congratulating us for our Navy's successful attack on Pearl Harbor. Until that moment, when we discovered what the excited French officer was trying to tell us, we were unaware of the great assault on the American air and naval bastion. Neither our constant bomber patrols over the ocean nor the reconnaissance flights over Singapore had yet discovered any activity by the British battleships. We could not understand what caused the enemy to delay throwing these powerful vessels into action. Today was the most critical phase of our operations. The Army troops were scheduled to invade Malaya. Should the British warships or their bombers attack our transports during the assault operation, we might be in serious trouble. The absence of the enemy fleet made us feel that something was amiss, that the British might spring a sudden attack upon us. I know that, had I been the commander of those two mighty warships, I would have taken them out to sea off Kota Bharu, the Army's invasion point on Malaya, and attacked. While we were standing by, waiting for orders to take off in the event of enemy action, we received word that our transports were moving into Kota Bharu. All the men of the Genzan Air Corps were sorely disappointed that the first great bombing of the war was made by the aircraft carriers attacking Pearl Harbor. On the other hand, our questions as to the effectiveness of our aerial bombs and torpedoes were fully answered by the smashing success of the carrier planes which had raided the Hawaiian Islands. December 9, 1941. This morning, one of our Type 98 reconnaissance planes flew over the Singapore naval base. All squadrons anxiously awaited the crew's report, which might reveal the location of the British battleships. The news was good. The two battleships were still anchored at Singapore. Everybody relaxed. Our troopships were free of the threat of the big British guns. Although we had nothing to fear from the warships as long as they remained in Singapore, at any moment the British might move the ships out to sea where they would be in a position to attack. Rear Admiral Matsunaga called a staff conference in his headquarters to determine the feasibility of having our bombers make a mass torpedo attack against the warships while they remained within the base. All pilots and aircrew members were in high spirits. We had found the battleships, and the opportunity to gain even more glorious fame than the men who had successfully attacked Pearl Harbor beckoned to us. Everybody was busy investigating the water depths at the Singapore naval base, the best directions from which to attack, and the most advantageous flight formations to utilize. At 5 Cos p.m., we received a radio message from our submarine I-56, which had been patrolling east of Singapore. The submarine commander stated, 3:50 p.m., 2 battleships proceeding northward. We could not understand the discrepancy between the report of the reconnaissance plane, which stated that the warships were still within the British base, and the submarine report that the Prince of Wales and the Repulse had taken to the high seas. Whatever the outcome, the Genzan Air Corps was ordered to assemble immediately for torpedo attack. Had the 2 powerful warships actually left the Singapore naval base? Or were there other enemy battleships in the area? Perhaps heavy cruisers had been mistaken for the battleships. Whatever the character of the British ships, their speed would bring them off the coast of Kota Bharu the following day. They must be located and destroyed before their powerful guns had the opportunity to destroy the invasion fleet. The order for torpedo attack was shortly received. The Type 98 reconnaissance plane returning to its base from the Singapore flight was ordered to change its destination and land immediately at the Saigon airfield. The photograph negatives were hurriedly developed. Now we know the truth. What had appeared to the naked eye from a great altitude to be warships were actually two large cargo vessels. The absence of the Prince of Wales and the repulse from Singapore Naval Base was confirmed. Delay was not permissible. The enemy's intentions were very clear. They were moving against the Kota Bharu invasion force. Our submarines, however, had lost contact with the enemy fleet, and the exact whereabouts of the British vessels remained a mystery. 7:00 p.m. All preparations for the torpedo attack were completed. With hopes of locating and attacking the British warships that evening or even during the night, we took off from our base in high spirits. We could not understand how the army discovered that we were leaving in search of the enemy ships, but large numbers of our army men had assembled at the base to see us off. The torpedoes were a great source of wonder to them. They waved and cheered loudly as our bombers left the ground. I do not understand why, but the occurrences of this day remain clearly in my mind. I was anxious to press the attack against the enemy. I can remember every small detail involving tonight's mission. Cumulonimbus clouds filled the sky as we flew south along the French Indochina coast, indicating that the weather might prove unfavourable. However, I did not fear for the safety of my men in the event we should run into storms. Every one of my planes that were scattered by the storm of 2 days ago had returned safely to the base, attesting to the ability of their pilots. Tonight we were determined to carry the attack to the enemy, even if storms should break up the formations, and if no more than 2 planes could fly together. We were determined not to be balked by the weather. All planes descended below cloud level in search of the enemy. A radio order received from Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, Commander-in-Chief of the South Area Force, indicated that all available surface and air units would be mobilized for night attack. Our submarine had sighted the enemy battleships. Now it was our air force's turn to destroy them. We did not intend to let our surface fleet take this big game away from us. Our fighting spirit was high. The sun had dropped below the horizon. Visibility was very poor, and we were flying in 3-plane formation. Unfortunately, there was still a serious problem to be solved. We had not decided, when the operation began, on any definite measures for differentiating between the enemy vessels and our own warships during close-range sea battles, when such identification can be extremely difficult. We did not know the definite location of the enemy warships. Furthermore, we had no information as to the location of our own ships that night. How were we to distinguish one from another? Even during daylight, identification of warships is generally difficult. At night, it becomes almost impossible. There is actually great danger of attacking our own warships and airplanes during combined operations of our sea and air forces, except under special conditions, such as when the vessels of either the enemy or friendly forces remain stationary. Not having received any training on this matter, and not having had time to discuss warship identification before we took off, our air and sea forces were rushing into the battle blindly. It seemed as if we might be caught in our own traps. The clouds seemed to stretch endlessly over the ocean. We could not emerge from them, and the task of observing the ocean surface was becoming increasingly difficult. We could not fly much higher than 1,000 feet. Under such conditions, our chances for discovering the enemy fleet were doubtful unless we happened to fly directly over the British ships or crossed their wakes. However, the situation was not hopeless. We had many airplanes searching the ocean, and any one of them might sight the enemy forces. There was also the chance that we might discover the enemy inadvertently in the event that he sighted our planes and fired upon them. When one flies in almost total darkness, one feels that the enemy might appear suddenly and without warning before one's eyes. Farther and farther we flew southward in search of the enemy fleet. A radio report from one of our searching bombers brought jubilation to our hearts. The anxiously sought enemy vessels had been sighted. The radio report continued, "We have dropped a flare bomb." One of the Mahiro Air Corps bombers had succeeded in sighting the enemy. With high spirits, we drove our planes to maximum speed and hastened toward the location of the enemy ships. Already the attack might be underway. We extracted the last ounce of power from our motors, trying to make the airplanes go faster and faster. Soon another radio message was received. "The vessel under our flare is the Chokai." Good heavens! Instead of being disappointed, I was appalled. We were in great danger of bombing our own fleet in place of the enemy's. Instead of attacking the British warships, we must now be extremely careful to avoid bombing and torpedoing the Japanese vessels in the area. Had we missed this last message, we would have pressed the attack against the Chokai heavy cruiser and the flagship of Vice Admiral Ozawa. We were sorely dejected. It appeared that we did not have a very good opportunity this night to discover the whereabouts of the enemy and to launch an attack. Soon after the Chokai was sighted, an order was received from Rear Admiral Matsunaga. "Discontinue operation. All planes return to base." The order to call off the search for the enemy enabled us to relax our tense muscles, yet we remained undecided as to what to do. It was possible that the British warships had broken through our air-sea screen and might even now be hurling their shells against our transports lying off Kotabaru. That was my greatest fear. We stifled the urge to continue searching for the enemy for a little while longer and turned back toward the base. Orders must be followed without hesitation. It seemed as if our problems that night would never end. To attempt a landing with a torpedo after the safety pin had been pulled is an extremely hazardous undertaking. We were anxious to dump the deadly weapons into the sea before landing. But no, we could not do this because the supply of torpedoes at the French Indochina bases was sorely limited. There was only one torpedo for each airplane. We could not afford to lose a single one. To ensure against possible landing accidents on the blacked-out field, each plane was kept in the air until the moon had risen. It was not until midnight that the landing strip became visible in the moonlight and the planes could land. Despite the exhaustion brought on by the harrowing flight through stormy weather, the long hours spent in the air, and the nerve-wracking landings with armed torpedoes, we were not given a chance to rest. Calling on our reserve stamina and courage, we worked through almost the entire night preparing for the next day's mission. Our primary duty involved reconnaissance. Since the movement of the enemy warships was completely unknown after our submarine lost the British vessels, it was the task of the bombers to search out their whereabouts. While every effort would be made to locate the enemy ships if they were still at sea, we had to consider the possibility that the warships might have returned to Singapore. Should they already be within the port, the enemy's resistance would be much greater and our attacks less effective. We would have to contend not only with the anti-aircraft weapons of the ships, but also with those of the naval base. Our airplanes would be limited in their attack formations. The worst problem of all was that, should we be forced to attack with torpedoes in Singapore itself, our bombers would not have sufficient fuel to return to their bases. We must by all means seek out and destroy the enemy vessels this morning. It was thereupon decided to send out 9 attack bombers and 2 Type 98 reconnaissance aircraft to search for the British warships early in the morning of December 10th. At the same time, we would dispatch a strong attack force to Singapore, regardless of the movement of the enemy vessels. Today's search mission was so difficult that, according to the pilot's calculations, only about half of the area in which the British ships might be found could possibly be covered. Although the desire of the commanding officers to use as many planes as possible out of the total available force of 100 aircraft was understandable, I did not think these tactics were intelligent. The men were almost worn out. December 10th. The sky was clear. Good visibility today. No unexpected troubles developed, and all battle preparations were completed on time for takeoff. At 6:25 a.m., all reconnaissance planes left their bases simultaneously. Between 7:35 and 9:30 a.m., torpedoes and bombing units took off. The airplanes mobilized for action that day included 9 Type 96 attack bombers and 2 Type 98 reconnaissance aircraft for search duty, 26 Type 96 attack bombers and 26 Type 1 attack bombers to carry torpedoes, and 34 Type 96 attack bombers carrying bombs. The leader of the reconnaissance group took a position in the center part of the search area, where the chance of sighting the enemy ships would be the greatest. The airplane carried many cameras with which to photograph the enemy ships and the scene of battle. The reconnaissance aircraft flying parallel to the leader succeeded in sighting the enemy first. Unfortunately, this latter plane did not carry cameras. I participated in this operation as second squadron leader of torpedo bombers of the Genzan Air Corps. In torpedo practice with my bomber on the ground, the aircraft released its torpedo without trouble. We knew when the torpedo had left the airplane by the strong vibrations transmitted to the airframe at the moment of release. As my particular bomber was the most dependable aircraft assigned for my exclusive use, I was completely at ease with both the plane and its engines. Everyone in the Corps had full confidence in his craft. All the crew members are veterans of the battles in China, but this was their first sea battle, and torpedoing enemy vessels is a hazardous operation. All my men felt pleasure as well as anxiety as we anticipated the coming battle. "Sir, what angle of fire shall I follow?" I was asked by a faithful young pilot in my squadron. Many factors enter into the final decision for the angle of fire to release the torpedo, but most of these must be determined by visual observation. The general principle of torpedo attack is easily understood. However, under combat conditions where the position of the target relative to the aircraft changes from moment to moment, only a considerable amount of past practice can accurately determine the precise angle of fire to release torpedoes. After giving the young pilot general instructions, I told him, "If you become too confused to determine the proper angle of fire, fly very low and aim your torpedo directly at the bow." Our commander, Admiral Matsunaga, painstakingly and kind-heartedly gave all the men their orders. When he had finished, Captain Kosei Maeda, our commanding officer, lectured the men severely. He told them to calm down and to put their strength in their abdomen. Commander Kamero Sonokawa, the Corps flight officer, issued detailed instructions on the possible movement of the enemy and outlined the plan of assault. Lieutenant Commander Nichi Nakanishi, the wing commander for the day, elaborated further on the attack plans. It was then my turn as the second squadron leader to speak, but there was nothing left for me to say. By the time my men had heard the instructions from the section leader and the chief of each plane who followed me, they had forgotten the previous lengthy instructions. The young crew members were thinking perhaps not of the long orders, but about the lunch in the planes. Young crew members are usually innocent of battle. A tasty lunch boosts their morale more than medals of valor or certificates of merit. Of all the food carried in the bombers, bean paste-coated rice cake, called ohagi, is the best. If, in addition, coffee syrup is carried in the vacuum bottles, they are in very high spirits and exhibit their great pleasure by the expressions on their faces even before the airplane takes off. It is an indisputable fact that there usually appears a trace of anxiety or uncertainty on the face of every man while on a bombing mission. When, however, a man exhibits calmness and efficiency in his duties, we feel proudly that he is really a crack crew member. Just how well the men will actually perform their duties in combat rests upon the skill and ability of the wing commanders and the squadron leaders. It is now 7:55 a.m., and the reconnaissance planes which left before dawn should be beyond the French Indochina coast and over the open sea. All the torpedo bombers took to the air and set a course straight for Singapore. Our foremost concern was our fuel supply. Ever since September, the Genzan Air Corps had made continuous studies on how to save fuel and increase the flight endurance of our bombers. We learned how to take advantage of wind conditions and what were the best power settings. Through careful use of the mixture control lever, we had succeeded in increasing our range by 20% without adding to our fuel load, as compared to our missions in China. As our planes carried torpedoes today, we had in our tanks about 30% less fuel than normal. We flew in a very large formation, and for safety reasons, our radius of operation was fixed at a maximum of 400 nautical miles. However, should we find the enemy ships more than 400 nautical miles from Saigon, we would naturally press home the attack. All pilots were trying to use as little fuel as possible. As the miles slipped beneath our wings and we flew farther south, the weather constantly improved. Finally, the sky was completely clear. We maintained a flight altitude of between 8,300 and 10,000 feet. Nearly 10 a.m. What is the matter with our reconnaissance planes? Still no sign of the enemy. In spite of the good weather and clear visibility, is it possible the reconnaissance planes still cannot find the British warships? By now our planes should be more than 500 nautical miles from Saigon. Wing Commander Nakanishi, flying just ahead of my bomber, must also be growing very impatient. We have passed the danger line of 400 nautical miles from Saigon. Still no report on the enemy ships. It is as though we were enveloped in complete darkness. The pilots are becoming more and more anxious about their remaining fuel. We measured the rate of fuel consumption as carefully as possible and reduced it to the lowest possible level. It was not the best way to treat the engines, but we had little choice. Perhaps because of our severe mixture control, one of my bombers developed engine trouble and was forced to leave the formation and return to base. I could not send even one plane as an escort. Including my own, the number of planes in my squadron was reduced to 7. At 11:45 a.m., we sighted a small vessel off to our left. The sea was absolutely calm. The ship appeared to be a cargo vessel of about 500 or 600 tons. Singapore was near. Since it was possible that other enemy vessels might be in the vicinity, I ordered my men to stay alert. No other object could be seen. This was unusual. Keeping a sharp lookout above and behind us for enemy planes, we tightened all formations and maintained our flight due south. Without warning, the entire 3rd Squadron dropped out of the mass formation and flew toward the small cargo vessel. Soon they circled over the ship. I could not understand what the squadron leader could possibly be doing. The enemy vessel suddenly changed its course, and no sooner had it begun its twisting evasive action than a salvo of bombs fell more than 700 feet away from the ship without inflicting any damage. What was wrong with the 3rd Squadron leader? 9 1,100-pound bombs were lost, dissipated without results, after all the trouble of carrying them for such a long time. The Level Bomber Squadron had already wheeled out of formation and was returning to its home base. We continued to fly southward. Far ahead and to our right, we could make out the southern tip of the Malayan Peninsula. If the enemy fleet was on the high seas, we certainly should have been able to sight it. Our commander appeared determined to seek out the enemy vessels right in Singapore if he failed to find them on the ocean. We were dangerously close to passing the point of no return, when we would lack the fuel to return to our base. Our only hope, in the event that we passed this point, was to make a forced landing at Kota Baru, which our troops had already invaded. All this time we were without word as to what had happened to the Mihoro and Kanoya Air Corps wings. There was no information as to their whereabouts. Perhaps, however, they purposely silenced their radios for fear of alerting the enemy. At 12:20 p.m., my wireless operator informed me that he had just received a message. I instantly left the pilot's seat and used the codebook to decipher the message, which revealed that the enemy fleet had been found. On the face of everyone aboard the plane, there appeared excitement and joy at having finally discovered the enemy. Soon there would be battle. The message read, "Sighted 2 enemy battleships, 70 nautical miles southeast of Kuantan. Course south-southeast, 11:45. The enemy was right behind us. I watched closely for the signal to turn and reverse our course. Strangely, the 1st Squadron continued to fly southward. We waited and waited, but no signal was received from the 1st Squadron to turn about and head for the enemy. 10 minutes went by, and I was becoming very anxious. Finally, I relayed the message concerning the sighting of the battleships to the other planes and, at the same time, began to gradually reverse our course in order to take over the lead of the formation. Seeing my maneuver, the planes of the first squadron also reversed their course and fell in behind my squadron. Our new heading was north-northwest. Anticipating the coming battle, all planes moved in and took up a close formation. We were flying just above 8,300 feet. Clouds had begun to fill the sky, but they did not restrict our view of the ocean below us. In spite of repeated warnings to the crew members not to relax for a moment their vigilance to the rear and above our airplanes, everybody was straining to look ahead of our bomber to sight the enemy fleet. Everybody wanted the honour of being first to see the British warships. It was just past 1 o'clock. Low clouds were filling the sky ahead of us. Fully 5 hours had passed since we left Saigon that morning. The enemy fleet should become visible any moment. I became nervous and shaky and could not dismiss the sensation. I had the strangest urge to urinate. It was exactly like the sensation one feels before entering a contest in an athletic meet. At exactly 1:03 p.m., a black spot directly beneath the cloud ahead of us was sighted. It appeared to be the enemy vessel, about 25 miles away. Yes, it was the enemy. Soon we could distinguish the ships. The fleet was composed of 2 battleships, escorted by 3 destroyers and 1 small merchant vessel. The battleships were the long-awaited Prince of Wales and the Repulse. The first squadron picked up speed and moved ahead of my squadron. Lieutenant Commander Nakanishi ordered, "Form assault formation." A little later, "Go in." The enemy fleet was now about 8 miles away. We were still flying at 8,300 feet and were in the ideal position to attack. As we had planned, Nakanishi's bomber increased its speed and began to drop toward the enemy fleet. He was headed to the right and a little ahead of the warships. Trying to maintain the same distance and not be left behind, the bombers of my squadron also increased their speed as I started a gradual dive. I headed toward the left flank of the enemy formation. It was a standard practice among us for the first squadron to attack the largest vessel and the second squadron the next largest. All crew members searched the sky vigilantly for the enemy fighters, which we expected would be diving in to attack us at any moment. Much to our surprise, not a single enemy plane was in sight. This was all the more amazing since the scene of battle was well within the fighting range of the British fighters, less than 100 nautical miles from both Singapore and Kuantan. Except for the planes which at this moment were screaming in to attack, no other aircraft could be seen. We learned later that the third reconnaissance plane, piloted by Ensign Hoshi, had first sighted the enemy battleships and alerted all the bombers. As soon as he had reported the presence of the enemy fleet and was informed that our bombers were rushing to the scene, Hoshi left the area to bomb the Kuantan air base to prevent the enemy fighters from taking off. Without interference from enemy fighters, we could make our attacks freely. Coordinating my movements with those of the first squadron, I led my squadron to the attack so that the enemy ships would be torpedoed from both flanks. The first squadron was circling about 4 miles to the left and forward of the enemy ships and was about ready to begin its torpedo run. Anti-aircraft shells were exploding all around the circling bombers. The planes could be seen between the flashing patches of white smoke as the shells exploded. Not a single anti-aircraft shell exploded near my squadron. Perhaps the clouds hid us from the enemy gunners. Through my binoculars, I studied the enemy's position. The large battleships were moving on a straight course, flanked by the 3 destroyers. The destroyers were just ahead of the battleships and making better than 26 knots. I could see clearly the long, white wakes of the ships as they cut through the water. A long, narrow plume of white smoke drifted upward from the second battleship. Later, I discovered this was due to a direct hit scored by the level bombers of the Mihiro Air Corps, which had made the first attack at 12:45 p.m. There was no doubt that it was a battleship. However, when I studied carefully the details of the vessel, it resembled, it even appeared to be, our battleship Congo. We were completely unaware of the whereabouts of our own surface forces in this area. It was not impossible that it was actually the Congo below us. The narrow escape of the Chokai from our bombers last night was still fresh in my memory, and my blood ran cold at the thought that we might be attacking our own vessels. However, the first squadron bombers were plunging into the attack, one after the other, and the enemy gunners, if it really was the enemy, were filling the sky with bursting anti-aircraft shells. I was still undecided about attacking. I called our observer and inquired as to the identity of the ship below us, stating that it greatly resembled the Congo. I was shocked to hear the observer reply, "It looks like our Congo to me, too." It was a terrible situation to be in. I could not decide whether or not the vessel was a British battleship or actually the Congo. I had been on the Congo 3 years ago and was trying to remember details of the battleship. To confess, I had not studied to any extent the details of British warships, but had concentrated instead on American vessels. My knowledge of the British vessels was very meagre. What further confused the situation was the repeated flag signal from the third plane of my squadron, "Is not the fleet ours?" Both the second and third bombers were watching my plane, as if asking for my decision. Even if the fleet now under attack was friendly, it would have no alternative but to open fire fiercely when some airplanes started action preparatory to an assault. And our level bombers had already attacked a short while ago. I could not assume the fleet to be hostile merely because it was defending itself and firing upon our planes. My squadron was requesting information again from me. I did not know what to do. Meanwhile, our bombers had passed the ideal point to commence the torpedo attack. We were now flying at 1,700 feet. The clouds were increasing steadily, and visibility was already reduced. It would be to our disadvantage to attack from the stems of the enemy ships. Boldly, the formations circled out from the protection of the clouds and checked once again the position of our targets. We were able to get a very good look at the battleship. I was greatly relieved. I was sure of it. The vessel below was not the Congo. I was nervous and upset and started to shake from the excitement of the moment. We turned and flew into the clouds again. We changed course while in the clouds to confuse the enemy and finally came out from beneath the clouds in attack position. This was possible because of a stratum of scattered clouds between 1,000 and 1,700 feet. We began the attack at an altitude of 1,000 feet and about 1.5 miles from the enemy. No sooner had we emerged from the protection of the clouds than the enemy gunners sighted our planes. The fleet opened up with a tremendous barrage of shells, trying to disrupt our attack before we could release our torpedoes. The sky was filled with bursting shells which made my plane reel and shake. The second battleship had already started evasive action and was making a hard turn to the right. The target angle was becoming smaller and smaller as the bow of the vessel swung gradually in my direction, making it difficult for me to release a torpedo against the ship. It was expected that the lead torpedo bomber would be compelled to attack from the most unfavourable position. This was anticipated, and it enabled the other planes following me to torpedo the target under the best of conditions. The air was filled with white smoke, bursting shells, and the traces of anti-aircraft guns and machine guns. As if pushed down by the fierce barrage thrown up by the enemy, I descended to just above the water's surface. The airspeed indicator registered more than 200 knots. I do not remember at all how I was flying the airplane, how I was aiming, and what distance we were from the ship when I dropped the torpedo. In the excitement of the attack, I pulled back on the torpedo release. I acted almost subconsciously, my long months of daily training taking over my actions. A giant battleship suddenly loomed before the plane. Passing very close to the towering stern, I swung into a hard turn and sped away from the warship. I began a wide circling turn in a clockwise direction, hastily easing the complaining bomber out of its steep climbing turn. Not many shells appeared to be bursting about us. The engines were still roaring loudly, and only moderate damage had been inflicted upon my airplane. I pulled up again in a steep climb and levelled off once we were within the clouds. I took a deep breath and forced my taut muscles to relax. Suddenly, my observer came stumbling forward through the narrow passageway, crying, "Sir, sir, a terrible thing has happened." When I looked at him in surprise, he shouted, "The torpedo failed to release." I felt as though cold water had been dashed over my head and entire body. We were still carrying the torpedo. I forced myself to be calm and reversed our course at once. I passed on my new orders to the men. "We will go in again at once." I began to lower our altitude as we flew through the clouds. The second torpedo run on the battleship would be very dangerous. The enemy gunners were fully alert and would be waiting for us. I did not like the idea of flying once again through a storm of anti-aircraft fire, which would be even worse than before. We dropped below cloud level. We were on the side of the enemy battleship, which was just swinging into a wide turn. Our luck was good. No better chance would come. I pushed the throttles forward to reach maximum speed and flew just above the water. This time I yanked hard on the torpedo release. Over the thudding impact of bullets and shrapnel smashing into the airplane, I felt the strong shock through the bomber as the torpedo dropped free and plummeted into the water. It was inexcusable that we did not notice the absence of this shock during the first torpedo run. The first squadron commander was sending out the attack reports by radio. Many torpedoes made direct hits, and the lead battleship is listing heavily but is returning to normal position, etc. As the outcome of my squadron's attack was impossible for me to determine, I merely radioed, "The second squadron has finished its torpedo runs." I waited for the bombers of my squadron to assemble. All through the attack, we concentrated only on scoring direct hits on the enemy vessels. We had ignored everything but the release of our torpedoes into the British battleships. We had even forgotten to worry about our own safety. Once we had released the torpedoes, however, we were able to study the situation about us. Tracer bullets and anti-aircraft shells filled the sky all about the airplanes, and we could feel the thud and shock vibrating all through the fuselage and wings as bullets and shrapnel ripped through the plane metal. It seemed to each of us that all the guns were aimed at our own plane. We became afraid of losing our own lives. Might this not be considered a normal reaction of human nature, this anxiety for one's own life? Pilots fare better in this respect than the crew members because they are so preoccupied with the many things necessary to fly their airplanes. It seems that the other crew members are unable to sit idly by as the bomber thunders in toward the enemy, flying right into the spitting orange and red flashes of his gun muzzles. They must have something to do, to occupy themselves, or their fear may become overpowering. The machine gunners later told me they could not help but open fire against the enemy battleships to sweep the decks with their bullets. In past days, when our missions over the China continent were to bomb Chongqing and Chengdu, it was the time spent between reaching the target and releasing the bombs that was most uncomfortable for the pilot. When our bombers were bracketed by enemy anti-aircraft and a shell would explode ahead and above the airplane, the acrid smell of the powder would fill the cockpit. It penetrated our nostrils and brought fear to our hearts. The shells were so close that we might be hit next. Only after we released our bombs and sped away from the city could we relax. In this respect, torpedo bombing and level bombing are the exact opposite of each other. I banked my airplane and studied the battle scene below us. White smoke poured from the second large battleship. This was due to a direct torpedo strike scored about 20 minutes before we attacked. The hit had been made by Lieutenant Yoshimi Shirai's bomber squadron of the Mihoro Air Corps. The level bombers had made their attack from a height of 11,700 feet, and in the first bombing run, a 550-pound bomb scored a direct hit. In the second attack, 2 550-pound bombs scored near misses. Commanded by Lieutenant Hachiro Shoji, the wing of the Mihiro Air Corps had actually left the French Indochina bases after we had taken off. Lieutenant Shirai's squadron of the Chihoro Air Corps wing, which had first bombed the enemy battleships, took off about 30 minutes after we left. Its course, however, was in a direct line with the enemy fleet, and it arrived on the scene first, immediately attacking the enemy. 16 bombers of the Gensan Air Corps torpedo squadrons had torpedoed the British fleet for about 9 minutes. One of the first squadron planes was hit immediately after releasing its torpedo. Somehow the pilot managed to keep control of the bomber and finally made a suicide crash with his crippled plane into the enemy. About 4 minutes later, 8 bombers of the Mihoro Air Corps torpedo squadron sent their torpedoes toward the second large battleship. Lieutenant Katsusaku Takahashi of the second squadron could not release his torpedo in the first attack. Once beyond the range of the enemy guns, he turned and hurtled once again into the deadly barrage thrown up by the enemy ships. Again, the torpedo failed to release. Somehow, Lieutenant Takahashi's bomber managed to survive the gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire. It was discovered later that the torpedo release mechanism had been hit by shrapnel and had jammed. Immediately behind the Mihoro Air Corps torpedo squadron, 26 Type 1 bombers of the Kanoya wing attacked the 2 battleships. They were led by Lieutenant Commander Shichizo Miyauchi. The Kanoya wing carried out their attacks over a period of 20 minutes. 2 of the bombers made suicide dives into the enemy ships after releasing their torpedoes. During a period of slightly less than 1 hour, 50 land-based attack bombers assaulted the 2 battleships, roaring in one after the other to release their torpedoes. The cumulative effect of the torpedo strikes was evident in the gradual loss of speed and control of the 2 battleships. When the Kanoya torpedo squadrons had completed their torpedo runs, 2 level bomber squadrons of the Mihira Air Corps arrived at a position directly above the enemy fleet, which was trying desperately to evade the constant torpedo attacks. The Mihiro Air Corps bombers were flying at 8,400 feet when they moved in to make their bombing runs. By now, the Repulse was a shattered hulk. It was still moving, but slowly, and was gradually losing speed. It had completely lost all fighting power and was no longer considered a worthwhile target. It was only a matter of minutes before the battlecruiser went down. To all appearances, the Prince of Wales was intact and defending herself furiously with an intense anti-aircraft barrage. She was selected as the next bombing target. 14 1,100-pound bombs were dropped. Several scored direct hits on the enemy warship. The bombs struck directly in the centre of the battleship. All the bombs of one squadron were wasted. While attempting to obtain an accurate bombing fix on the Prince of Wales, the squadron leader accidentally tripped his bomb release. He was still far from the enemy battleship when his bombs dropped. The other planes in the squadron, when they saw the bombs falling from the lead aircraft, immediately released their own bombs, which fell harmlessly into the sea. Ensign Hoshi's plane caught the dramatic last moments of the 2 battleships. Minute by minute, as he circled above the stricken warships, he radioed back a vivid report of what was happening far below him. 20 minutes after being hit by torpedoes, the Repulse began to sink beneath the waves. By 2:20 p.m., the great ship was gone. A few minutes later, a tremendous explosion ripped through the Prince of Wales. 20 minutes after the Repulse had sunk, the Prince of Wales started her last plunge and disappeared quickly. All pilots and crew members in the bombers returning to their bases were jubilant and flushed with victory. We happily listened to each of Ensign Howashi's radio reports as he told how the burning and exploding enemy ships were sinking. Back at the airfields in French Indochina, a second wave of bombers was being readied for another assault on the enemy battleships. The base had not been able to obtain accurate information on the progress of the battle and was prepared to launch another mass attack. However, as soon as it received the reports from Ensign Hoshi's plane as he circled the area, the attack was called off. While he observed the sinking Prince of Wales, Hawashi sighted 8 enemy fighters racing to the scene. Their belated appearance was of no avail, for the Repulse and the Prince of Wales had already disappeared beneath the waves. Hawashi immediately fled to the protection of nearby clouds. As the enemy fighters searched vainly for his reconnaissance plane, he skillfully eluded his pursuers and returned safely to base. This was indeed fortunate for us. Had Hawashi's plane failed to confirm the results of the battle, Our future operations would necessarily have been based on the assumption that the two mighty warships had not been destroyed. Our freedom of action would have been severely curtailed, for we dared not send surface units into an area in which the big guns of the British warships might destroy them. The great ability of our pilots to wrest every possible mile of range out of their bombers was soon made apparent in dramatic fashion. We feared that many of our planes would be compelled to make forced landings at Kota Bharu, since we had flown beyond our calculated point of no return, and then engaged in fuel-consuming battle maneuvers. Actually, not a single plane was forced to make an emergency landing at Kota Bharu, and all bombers were able to return to their respective bases in Indochina. Furthermore, only the 3 planes which fell in flames during the sinking of the enemy warships failed to return, and all 3 planes had managed to crash into the battleships. It was a great and glorious victory. Subsequent interrogation of pilots indicated that 35 torpedo bombers and 8 level bombers had attacked the swift battlecruiser Repulse. The Genzan Air Corps released 7 torpedoes against the Repulse, of which 4 struck the ship. Of the more than 20 torpedoes released against the Repulse by the Kanoya Air Corps, at least 10 were seen to explode against the warship. 4 of 7 torpedoes released by the Mihoro Air Corps bombers went true to their target. 16 550-pound bombs were dropped against the Repulse by Mihoro Air Corps bombers. 1 scored a direct hit and 2 fell as near misses. The Prince of Wales was attacked by 15 torpedo bombers. The Genzan Air Corps released 9 torpedoes, of which 4 struck the battleship. Each of 6 Kanoya Air Corps bombers dropped a torpedo, scoring 4 hits on the Prince of Wales and 1 hit on an escorting destroyer. 8 level bombers of the Mihiro Air Corps dropped 14 Yoichi 100-pound bombs on the battleship. Of these, 2 were direct hits. 9 other bombers of the same Air Corps dropped 18 1,100-pound bombs, but failed to score any hits. A total of 49 torpedoes were released in the attack. More than 26 of these struck the 2 battleships and 1 of the escorting destroyers. Of the 16 550-pound bombs dropped, only 1 scored a direct hit. 41 1,100-pound bombs were released, 18 were prematurely dropped, and 2 direct hits were obtained. The Repulse was attacked initially by the Mihoro Air Corps under the command of Lieutenant Hachiro Shoji, who first dropped bombs on the Repulse at 12:45 p.m. The first torpedoes struck the Repulse at 1:22 p.m., and the battlecruiser went down at 2:20 p.m. At 1:14 p.m., the first 4 torpedoes crashed into the Prince of Wales. The battleship sank at exactly 2:30 p.m. Our search aircraft, which had remained over the battle area to confirm the destruction of the 2 British warships, discovered 8 approaching enemy fighters at 3 p.m. and immediately left the scene. The Battle of Malaya was fruitful in more ways than just the destruction of Britain's 2 most powerful warships in this area. The lesson to be learned from the battle was different from that at Pearl Harbor, where an anchored and unsuspecting enemy fleet was surprised. The British commanders were fully aware that a Japanese carrier task force had recently assaulted Pearl Harbor with devastating results, and that surface ships did not actually participate in the destruction visited upon the American installations. It was a mistake leading to the most serious consequences that the British failed to heed this lesson and provide air protection for their prized battleships. This was more surprising since it was most obvious from the moment our reconnaissance planes discovered the whereabouts of the British fleet, which seriously threatened Japanese surface operations, that we would launch an intensive aerial assault against the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. It was incredible that the 2 warships should be left naked to attack from the skies. Interception of our level and torpedo bombers by British fighter aircraft might have seriously disrupted our attack and perhaps permitted the 2 warships to escape destruction. The Battle of Malaya illustrated in the most forcible manner that a surface fleet without fighter protection was helpless under enemy air attack. The battleship, long the ruler of the seas, had been toppled from its dominant position and was now just another warship to be destroyed by aerial assault. On the day following the sinking of the Prince of Wales and the repulse 100 miles from Singapore, our Navy was subjected to its only defeat in the opening months of the war. The dramatic victory of air power over sea power, as demonstrated in the Malaya Sea Battle, was still being jubilantly received in Japan when the invasion force that had attacked tiny Wake Island was soundly thrashed by small defending American forces and forced to flee for safety. Considering the power accumulated for the invasion of Wake Island and the meagre forces of the defenders, it was one of the most humiliating defeats our Navy had ever suffered. At the time of this operation, our Navy was hard-pressed for the services of every available aircraft carrier, and none could be spared for the invasion of Wake Island on December 11th. The Navy did not have fighter aircraft capable of reaching the island from the nearest Japanese base on Kwajalein, 600 nautical miles distant in the Marshall Islands. The offensive action against the American garrison on Wake Island consisted of repeated bombing with some 30 attack bombers during the 3 days of December 8th to 10. On December 11th, the invasion forces moved in to take the island. Rear Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka, commander of the 6th Destroyer Squadron, led the invading forces. At his disposal was the Wake invasion force composed of the light cruiser Yubari with 6 destroyers and accompanying vessels, and the light cruisers Tenryu and Tatsuta, commanded by Rear Admiral Kuninori Marumo. The enemy guns on Wake Island resisted this attempted invasion so violently that the cruiser Yubari was damaged, and the destroyer Hayate sunk, compelling the attack force to withdraw beyond the range of the enemy defences. Also opposing the invasion force were about 4 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters of the United States Marine Corps. Our fleet was at the mercy of these few fighter airplanes, which made consistent machine gun and bombing attacks upon our ships. Their persistent strafing and bombing caused considerable damage to the light cruisers Tenryu and Tatsuta and sank our destroyer Kisaragi. The destroyer sinking resulted indirectly from bombing by the little American fighters, a bomb from which exploded amidst depth charges stored on deck, causing a greater explosion which tore the ship apart. The Wildcats were among the few American fighters most active in the early days of the war. Their pilots were indeed gallant men. His confidence in the invasion shaken by the fierce resistance of the enemy shore guns and the elusive Grumman fighter planes, Rear Admiral Kajioka withdrew his fleet to Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands, where he could reorganize his forces for another assault upon the enemy. Fully cognizant of the gravity of the situation, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, ordered Admiral Chuichi Nagumo to assist Admiral Kajioka in the Wake Island invasion. Admiral Nagumo was at this time returning from his devastating attack upon Pearl Harbor. On December 15th, Rear Admiral Taimon Yamaguchi's 2nd Carrier Division, with the aircraft carriers Soryu and Hiryu escorted by 4 destroyers, was ordered to proceed immediately to the area north of Wake Island. Accompanying the carrier force was Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe's 8th Cruiser Division, with the heavy cruisers Tone and Chikuma. Approximately 5 days were required for the aircraft carriers, cruisers and destroyers to assemble off Wake Island for the second invasion attempt. In the interim, our land-based attack bombers pounded the island constantly, but could do little to stop the harassing attacks of the defending Grumman fighters. By December 21st, Yamaguchi's 2nd Carrier Division was approximately 200 nautical miles northwest of Wake Island. Yamaguchi dispatched 18 Type 99 dive bombers, VALs, escorted by 18 Zero fighters, to attack the island. Heavy clouds prevented the Zero fighters from engaging in combat with the enemy Wildcats. The following day, 18 Type 97 bombers, Kates, escorted by 18 Zeros, again bombed Wake Island. As the Zero fighters, under the command of Lieutenant Masaharu Suganami, could not see any enemy fighters in the air, they dropped down to strafe enemy ground positions. Their strafing runs were timed to hit the island simultaneously with the attack of the bombers. As the fighters swept low over the island, Lieutenant Heijiro Abe's bomber group was suddenly attacked by a single Grumman fighter. The enemy pilot had skillfully eluded our Zeros by remaining hidden in nearby clouds, diving in to attack the bombers as the Zeros made their strafing runs. Before the Zeros could reach the scene, 2 bombers had been shot down. The Grumman was quickly destroyed by the Zeros. No further flights were made by the defending enemy planes. Once we had achieved command of the air over the island, the invasion became the responsibility of the surface force, plus covering aircraft. The powerful enemy shore guns, which had been so effective against the first invasion fleet, could not manifest their full strength with our bombers and fighters waiting to attack the moment their positions were revealed. With the aid of constant dive bombing by the planes of the carriers Soryu and Hiryu, our Marines moved in to take the island on December 23rd. They were most anxious to vindicate themselves for the disgraceful failure of their first attempt and succeeded in capturing the island on this date. According to American military reports made available after the war, on December 21st, Rear Admiral Fletcher's aircraft carrier Saratoga was about 600 nautical miles northeast of Wake Island. The Saratoga was racing to aid the beleaguered American garrison. Had Rear Admiral Yamaguchi's 2nd Carrier Division not been hastily dispatched to Wake Island, or had the order to assist Rear Admiral Kajioka been delayed even a few days, the second landing operation might also have been shattered by the American aircraft carrier force. Our humiliating defeat during the initial landing operation, and this was the only such defeat early in the war, and the valuable lessons obtained at such high price appeared to have been quickly forgotten. Japan was much too jubilant at the news of victory which rolled in from all corners of the Pacific to heed the bitter lesson of Wake Island. In contrast to our failure fully to assimilate the lesson of this battle and that of the Malaya Sea Battle into our military organization, the United States frankly accepted the lessons of defeat in the early days of the war. Realizing that the war in the Pacific would be decided not on the ground or on the sea, but in the air, the United States mobilized all its resources and gave the highest priority to the mass production of military aircraft and the expansion of its air forces. With the exception of Rear Admiral Yamaguchi's 2nd Carrier Division, which joined the Wake Island operation, all units of the victorious Nagumo force on December 23rd returned from Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima Bay, where Admiral Yamamoto awaited the fleet. Refueled and re-equipped, the task force under Vice Admiral Nagumo's command, with the aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Shokaku and Zuikaku, left Hiroshima Bay on January 5, 1942, for the main battle areas of the South Pacific. In late January, our Army and Navy landing forces invaded Rabaul, New Britain, and Kavieng, New Ireland. Nagumo Task Force planes assisted the assault operations by raiding Rabaul, Kavieng, Lae and Salamaua, the latter 2 objectives on the northeast coast of New Guinea, and quickly eliminated enemy air resistance. In mid-February, with the invasion operations successfully concluded, Admiral Nagumo ordered Admiral Hara back to Japan with the 5th Carrier Divisions Shokaku and Zuikaku. These he replaced with the Soryu and Hiryu of the 2nd Carrier Division, commanded by Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, thus maintaining his original strength of 4 large aircraft carriers. On February 15th, the reformed Nagumo force left Palau Island and worked its way southward through the Dutch East Indies Islands, moving toward Port Darwin, the powerful enemy stronghold on Australia's northwest coast. On the 19th, Commander Fuchida led a mass formation of 190 planes against the enemy bastion, during which his fighters wiped out an opposing force of 8 enemy fighter planes. We wrecked or set aflame an additional 15 planes on the ground. Our bombers sank 2 destroyers and 8 other vessels. Some 7 smaller ships received bomb hits or near misses, and low-level ground attacks set 3 aircraft hangars aflame. The Port Darwin attack revealed to our pilots that they had little to fear in the way of enemy fighter plane opposition. The Zero clearly outflew all of the enemy fighters encountered over Australia, and despite our advantage in numbers during this initial attack, our pilots felt no qualms about future engagements. Its mission accomplished in its first assault, the Nagumo force swung about and anchored within Staring Bay on the southeast coast of Celebes Island. Simultaneously with the Port Darwin raid, our Navy land-based air forces under Vice Admiral Tsukahara, operating from newly occupied fields in southern Borneo, repeatedly blasted enemy targets in the Java Sea area. On February 27th, Tsukahara's reconnaissance planes sighted the United States seaplane tender Langley on the open sea south of Java Island. Immediately, Tsukahara dispatched 6 Zero fighters and 9 Type 96 Nell bombers against the American ship, which they caught approximately 75 nautical miles south of Java's Cilacap port. The Nells turned in an outstanding performance for level bombers, hitting the enemy vessel directly with 5 bombs and scoring several near misses. Shattered and apparently without power, the Langley soon drifted helplessly. Later, the crippled and abandoned hulk went under from torpedoes fired by an escorting American destroyer. Our intelligence reported that the Langley had entered the Java Sea to assist the beleaguered Dutch East Indies forces, especially those on Java Island, by ferrying 32 Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk fighter planes and their pilots from Australia. We could only conclude that the Americans risked the Langley in an area known to be under constant surveillance by our planes, because the Dutch need for fighters was so desperate, and because the Allies lacked a fighter plane capable of flying non-stop between Australia and Java. Again, we took satisfaction from the excellent long-range characteristics of the Zero fighter. The strategic significance of the Zero's ability to fly long distances was clearly demonstrated by this incident. Because of the Zero's long range, our Navy gained, at the war's outset, 3 aircraft carriers, which were relieved of their original Philippines attack assignment. Conversely, the United States Navy lost its seaplane tender Langley simply because of the inferior performance of the early 1942 American fighter planes. The following day, February 28th, we capped the destruction of the American ship with another severe blow at the enemy's dwindling sea power. Our land-based attack bombers caught the British cruiser Exeter, damaged on the 27th in a running sea battle, and sent it to the bottom. Also destroyed in the bombing attack were the British destroyer Encounter and the American destroyer Pope. Early in March, the Nagumo force left Staring Bay and steamed for the open sea south of Java Island. On March 5th, its planes raided Cilacap, catching a large number of enemy vessels. Our planes swarmed over the assembled enemy ships, sinking 2 American destroyers and many other small vessels. This action literally cut off the escape route of the Allied forces then in Java, which, pressed by our advancing troops, now stood on the edge of total collapse. Without further targets to occupy it in southern Java waters, the Nagumo force returned to Staring Bay. Vice Admiral Nagumo now increased his aircraft carrier strength. He dispatched the Kaga to Japan for repairs and supplies, and added to his force the 5th Carrier Division under Rear Admiral Hara, bringing his strength to 5 carriers, the Akagi, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. On March 26th, the Nagumo force left Staring Bay and steamed at full speed for the Bay of Bengal, where our intelligence reported powerful units of the British fleet. Vice Admiral Nagumo fully appreciated the tremendous enemy strength which would face him in his attempt to destroy British sea power, for the English had steadily reinforced their original fleet units of 2 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, and several light cruisers and destroyers. The Indian Ocean was fast becoming a British lake, and Nagumo's orders were to smash this enemy strength. His intelligence reported to Nagumo that he might also face more than 300 British warplanes, then based on Ceylon Island and on fields along the Bay of Bengal. On the evening of April 4th, a British flying boat patrol sighted the Nagumo force sailing under full steam for Colombo on Ceylon, hoping to catch unawares the British warships. It was only 24 hours before the first scheduled raid against Colombo. Zero fighters hastily launched from the carriers destroyed the enemy plane, but we feared the plane might have reported by radio its discovery of our fleet. This made it imperative that the initial Colombo attack be a maximum-strength aerial assault. The following morning, our carriers launched their planes, 36 Zeros, 36 Type 99 Val dive bombers, and 53 Type 97 Kate attack bombers. We discovered all too quickly that the British patrol bomber had managed to get out a sighting report on our fleet, for a swarm of enemy fighter planes plunged from the sky against our air formations. Again, the inferior performance of the Allied fighter airplanes and the superior skill of our pilots paid handsome dividends. The ensuing air battle between the approximately 60 enemy planes and our Zero fighters resulted in the destruction of almost all the enemy aircraft, which the Zeros prevented from disrupting the bomber formations. Even as the fighter planes swirled over the ocean, bombs hurtled down toward the British port. We sank 1 British destroyer, 1 large merchant ship and 10 smaller vessels, and heavily damaged land installations. Even as the Colombo raid continued, a radio message from one of his reconnaissance planes to the southwest was handed to Admiral Nagumo. The message read, "2 enemy destroyers sighted, heading south-southwest, speed 25 knots." The enemy ships were placed at approximately 300 nautical miles south-southwest of the air battles raging over Colombo. As there were no longer any worthwhile targets in the blasted British port, Nagumo immediately launched every available dive bomber on his carriers, which had been held in readiness for a possible second attack against Colombo. Destruction of the destroyers would complement the Colombo attack. Led by Lieutenant Commander Takashige Agusa, Air Group Commander of the Soryu, the 80 Type 99 Val dive bombers began their hunt for the 2 destroyers. Even as the planes raced toward the enemy ships, Admiral Nagumo received a corrected message. The enemy vessels were not destroyers as originally reported, but actually cruisers. On the flagship, Nagumo's staff officers waited for word from the dive bomber force. Finally, the first report from Lieutenant Commander Agusa was handed to the Admiral. "Sighted enemy vessels. Get ready to go in. Air Group, 1st Cardiff, take the first ship. Air Group, 2nd Cardiff, take the second ship." Several minutes passed without further messages. Then, "Ship number 1 has stopped, dead in water, listening heavily. Ship number 2 is aflame. Ship number 1 has sunk. Ship number 2 has sunk." The entire attack involved only 19 minutes, from 1:40 to 1:59 p.m., Tokyo time. Reconnaissance photographs of the 2 ships under attack identified them as the British cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire. Commander Agusa's dive bomber force established an all-time record in bombing accuracy in the destruction of the 2 cruisers. Perhaps the bombing conditions were perfect. Whatever the reason, every bomb literally either struck the enemy ships or scored a near miss. So thick were the explosions from the rain of bombs that many plane crews could not determine whether they had actually released their missiles. Only after all our planes had assembled in formation and the pilots could visually check the racks of other planes could we tell whether or not several planes were still armed. Following the Colombo attack and the sinking of the 2 cruisers, the Nagumo force regrouped and moved eastward, planning to attack Trincomalee on Ceylon on April 9th. Again, we encountered the far-searching British patrol bombers. On April 8th, a flying boat sighted our fleet and reported its finding to enemy headquarters. Admiral Nagumo again anticipated heavy fighter plane opposition and ordered another maximum-strength assault to be flown.